Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is my friend from Central Tennessee, Greg Wade, president of the Franklin Civil War Roundtable. Greg, how you doing tonight?
Hey, Chris, doing great. Yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you, and even better now that I'm having the chance to hang out with you for a little bit.
Well, there you go. The miracle of Zoom.
No kidding. So, and I know a lot of people are Zoom fatigued, but I've got to tell you, it's been just a lot of fun to be able to stay in touch with people and talk Civil War with folks from all over the country because of it. So I've been pretty happy about it.
Well, in corporate life, I didn't like Zoom at all, but this is a whole lot more fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And it works pretty good too, really.
So before we started, I'm going to put Greg on the spot here right away. I told him I wouldn't, but before we started, he has two flags on the wall behind him, and I just want to give him the opportunity to share those, the stories of those flags for folks who are watching on the video podcast, because I think they were great little stories. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Well, sure. I appreciate it. In fact, I got several of those around my office here, but the two that you can see, one was my son-in-law, one was my daughter. Both of them were in Afghanistan. And they flew those flags and presented them to me, and I had them framed and put on the wall. They were in Kandahar when these were flown.
Wow.
So it's an honor to have them.
What a nice treat. And you said that your daughter was a nurse.
She is a lieutenant commander in the Navy. She's a nurse. People assume if you say Navy, they're in the ocean, but she was in the middle of Afghanistan. Son-in-law was a medic with SEAL Team 6, and that's how they met in one of the clinics when he got injured a little bit. So,
okay,
a lot of history there.
Jeez, wow. Well, thank you for sharing those stories with us tonight. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
So I actually asked Greg if he'd come and hang out for a little bit this evening and talk about the Battle of Franklin. We've got the battle coming up here at the end of November, and as the president of the Civil War Roundtable, who knows more about Franklin than a dude who's living right there? So give us the 30-second synopsis, Greg, of what actually happens at the Battle of Franklin, and then we can kind of unpack that a little bit more.
Well, first of all, I'm certainly not the expert you just alluded to, but I know a little bit about it. And to the folks in your audience, I probably can't blow smoke at them like I might other people. But no, the Battle of Franklin was a culmination of a series of missteps and miscommunications among the Army of Tennessee as it marched north in the fall of 1864. Of course, as you know, they fought all the way to Atlanta. And then the Richmond High Command decided to replace Joe Johnson with John Bell Hood and gave Hood orders to head back to Nashville with the hopes of several things. One of the hopes was that Sherman would pull back out of the Deep South and pursue them, which of course he didn't. Another one of the hopes is that they could actually come back and take Nashville and put a panic into the Midwest. Really, something that's not talked about a lot is a lot of that had to do, I believe, with the Confederate High Command trying to find some leverage to seek peace terms at some point. And if they were threatening Nashville or could threaten Louisville, that would certainly have done the trick. Unfortunately, though, for the Confederates, they lost the real opportunity at Spring Hill when the night before the Battle of Franklin, Schofield threw. It's been debated ever since. Somehow, some way, some miracle, he marched right by the Confederate Army with 30,000 troops and beat them to Franklin. And then, of course, the next day, Hood wakes up, realizes what had happened. They force march all the way to Franklin, which was about a 15-mile march. And they set off and had a 5-hour battle that started at 4 o'clock that afternoon. It was a massacre, basically.
And 4 o'clock, that's late as far as sunset's concerned at the end of November.
It's about dark, yeah. And it was, they called it what they called it was an Indian summer day. We've been having that weather here a lot lately, and it's reminding me of that. Blue skies and warm temperatures. And I imagine that was just almost surreal to those guys marching forward there to their deaths.
Yeah. And I think about like what it must have felt. You wake up having lost this opportunity. So there's just a tremendous amount of frustration and confusion. Then you force march for 15 miles. And as the sun is setting, you have to basically launch yourself into battle. That had to have been a tense situation for Confederate soldiers.
Had to have been tense. There was probably some disbelief. And don't forget too, they've been fighting since Chickamauga, all the way to the Atlanta campaign, and then all the way back north. Now, a lot of the soldiers were local boys, and I think some of those guys were almost happy about coming back up because some of them slipped away and went home for a while. Saw mama, but so there were some desertions because of that. I don't really believe the rank and file thought they were going to attack until they actually deployed in line in Franklin. It just seemed too ridiculous. But they'd been asked to do that in the past. Hood had done it in the past, places like Gaines Mill, and had been successful. And I'm certain that he thought they could pull it off.
And to me, it strikes me as such an odd juxtaposition because, I mean, they marched to Spring Hill out of Columbia because Hood's trying to outflank Schofield to get in his rear. So then to suddenly, the next day, like, we're just going to go into a frontal assault. A much different mindset that Hood's got there.
Well, he has a sense of loss because he knew he had lost a great opportunity for a big victory. But I think that he still thought that because the Federals fled the way they did, no, they weren't set up for a fight. Matter of fact, the Federal Army was not prepared to fight. They just wanted to get out of Franklin and get to Nashville. But the reason they dug in on the south side of Franklin was because the bridges were out, and they had to wait until the bridges could be repaired enough to get their trains and everything out. As you know, the next morning, a lot of the Federals thought they lost the battle. They didn't even really know until the news started filtering in about the cost they'd inflicted on the Confederate Army.
So now you mentioned that the bridges were out. Talk to me just a little bit about the geography of Franklin, because I know that as Schofield's moving north, he gets pinned up against the Harpeth River. How does the battlefield look if you're John Bell Hood standing in Winstead Hill, looking at all that in front of you?
Well, the Battle of Franklin, compared to a lot of battles, is not hard to understand. Some battles confuse me. Chickamauga confuses me, or Stones River. Battle of Franklin was just a straight on 2 mile across meadows, dead on charge. From flank to flank was probably a mile and a half, 20,000 troops. And they were just marching straight in on a 2 mile charge across some fairly rolling land. And so as they stepped off, they were protected a little bit by just some gentle ridges. But at that point in time, it was wide open farmland. And they knew the Federals were behind works on the south side of town. This was a south to north attack. Franklin is nestled in a curve in the Harpeth River. The Harpeth River is right behind or north of Franklin, and it's bigger than a creek, not as big as a big river, but it's a substantial river. And so what they had hoped is that they could break the Federal lines and trap them up against the river. And people say, well, what works were they in? Well, there had actually been other actions there in that general area earlier in the war, a couple 1863 fights. So there were already some earthworks there, and they just had to fall in behind them. And but I was reading a quote earlier about a guy, Wagner's brigade. Wagner was part of the Federal forces that were out in the forward part of the fight as a skirmish line. And he talked about how it was unbelievable what he was looking at. And he stood there in amazement. And they all stood there in amazement until they realized they weren't stopping. They were still coming. Then it got serious.
And Wagner's position in advance of the main Federal line has sparked a little bit of controversy since then. Tell me a little bit about that controversy and whether you thought it was a good position or bad position for him to be in.
Well, Wagner was probably half a mile maybe in front. There were a few hundred soldiers out front, and they had very, very modest works that they'd thrown up real quickly. I would assume that the thought process was that they would slow down any Confederate attack, or they could report back and explain to their superiors what was going on. But actually what happened was Confederates hit them really hard, and they took off running back towards the Federal lines. And when they did that, their comrades in arms behind those works could not fire at the Confederates for fear of hitting Wagner's troops. And so Wagner's guys flow back through the lines, and that's really where the Federal line broke, was right there at the Carter House. And there was a controversy between Wagner and his commander. They almost came to blows about the whole thing. Opdyke was his commander, and he wound up coming back up with another brigade further towards town and plugged that hole up. And ultimately, that's what saved them.
So, in fact, there's a little monument there by the Carter House that talks about Updike's assault. So, before we kind of get into some of these, and I won't go too far into the weeds on these, but before the attack actually launches, I recall that Nathan Bedford Forrest actually suggested, "Hey, let me take some guys and we can outflank this position." Um, was that a viable plan, or these guys have been marching all day? No, it's time to go in before we run out of daylight. Tell me a little bit about that.
That's a really big question. A lot of people since the war, of course, had become somewhat of a scapegoat for making the attack and the blunder at Spring Hill and all that. Over the years, though, I think history has been kinder to Hood as more and more information has come out. But Forrest did indeed say, I forget what he said, give me a couple brigades and I'll flank them. But I'm not so sure how viable that was. You had the Federals escaped Franklin, were still heading up the highway. He would have had to cross that same river. He would have had to dealt with Federal cavalry, and Wilson was there and presented pretty well at Franklin. So was that feasible? We'll never know. It's a what if. I'm not so sure Forrest could have pulled it off.
It is one of those.
I think his goal was to try to flank them and cut them off the way they were cut off at Spring Hill, but that opportunity was gone.
And of course, the myth of Forrest, of course he could do it. He'll swim across himself and sing, and people attribute these supernatural successes to Forrest. But he and Wilson had been squaring off pretty regularly up into that point in the campaign, and Wilson, who I'm not an especially big fan of because of his poor performance in the Wilderness, but Wilson holds his own against Nathan Bedford Forrest through much of that campaign. So I don't think we could just assume that Forrest would brush him off the map if he makes that kind of move.
Well, as you know, Wilson was an engineer and didn't become a cavalryman until late in the war. And it's almost like you could see the learning process. Yeah. And I do think Forrest was a brilliant commander, but Wilson was by this time was pretty formidable.
Yeah. Now, I want to give you full credit for this because you made a comment to me the last time I was out visiting you about Forrest, and as controversial as Forrest is, bottom line,
he could read the ground better than probably anybody since George Patton. He had no training, but he combined bravery, just sheer grit of an outdoorsman, with an ability to read terrain as well as anybody I've ever read about. He did, though. He does take some of the fault for Spring Hill because he was at Spring Hill when Schofield passed him by. What we understand, though, is that he was almost out of ammunition and it was late and they were just all worn out. But, if you're going to go into a fight, you got to pick a couple of guys. Forrest to be one of them.
Which I think is, rubber meets the road wisdom.
Right.
So Hood makes this decision to launch the attack. And he watches this from Winstead Hill, where today there's now a park and an observation platform. Put me in his shoes for a second as he's given the go order for this. What's he thinking? What's he hoping for?
Hood had proven to be a hard fighter the entire war. He lost the use of his arm at Gettysburg. He lost his leg at Chickamauga. No one could question his bravery or his dedication. I think we will never know how he felt physically. I don't know how the man did what he did physically, because he had to be in pain and he had to be exhausted. But I think when he gets to Winstead Hill, he had a lot of confidence in his army. The army was in pretty good shape at that point in time, considering what they'd been through. Morale was pretty high. Like I said earlier, a lot of them were coming close to their homes. And they could see taking Nashville and changing the course of the war. And even though the frontal assault seems really ludicrous, they still almost broke that line. They came really, really close. And he had broken lines in the past. Now, of course, Hood is looked to be as a murderer and a scapegoat and all that, where Lee did the same thing and picked his charge, and he's still a hero. It's it's just the way history treats some people. I don't think Hood would order the assault if he didn't think they could have done it.
I really like the perspective you share there, because a lot of people do sort of dismiss this as foolhardiness or foolishness. But I mean, you talk about the confidence that Hood has in his men at this point, and he's got some pretty hard-bitten fighters in his divisions there in his corps. So there's a lot of confidence there. As the battle unfolds and the different waves go in, is he still feeling good, or does he see that there's disaster imminent?
That's a good question. The thing kept going till after dark, and nobody really knows how many attacks they sent in. Some say 5, some say 10. How many waves? Part of his army hadn't come up yet. Spring Hill, Stephen Lee's folks weren't up yet. He had very little of his artillery. I think Hood, though, probably in his gut knew that it wasn't going well, but he kind of convinced himself that he had done well, because at the end of the day, he held the ground. As hollow as that was. Federals, of course, they did pull out. There are actually stories of fistfights between soldiers trying to get across the river because they didn't know what was coming up behind them. And like I said earlier, I don't even think the Federals knew they won a great victory until the next day or so. But I think as the reports started coming back to Hood about he lost like 80 regimental commanders in the fight. And he had to have known his losses were terrific.
Of course, among those losses, most famously, Patrick Cleburne, who seems to have this prophetic sense of foreboding going into there with that famous quote of his, "If we're going to die, Govan, let us die like men." Is there a different sense in the command on sort of the division and brigade levels than Hood has at the top or with the corps levels?
Well, I don't know if Cleburne didn't think they could pull it off or not. I just think he saw there was a 2-mile open pasture and he probably wasn't going to live.
Yeah.
And you bring up an interesting point. I've always been amazed these guys did that. I mean, I've always said, if I ever survive one charge, I'm not doing it again, boss. I mean, it's just not going to happen. You can shoot me. What are you going to do? These guys they've been doing this for months. And Cleburne had seen enough. He'd seen enough. He knew he was going to be on a horse. He knew he'd be a target. And I guess it's better to go into that being fatalistic and then maybe surviving than it is being naive.
Yeah. So Cleburne does eventually get mortally wounded and killed on the battlefield. It's marked today by a pyramid of cannonballs. Can you tell me a little bit about the circumstances to his death?
Well, he had obviously almost made it to the federal lines. They were, excuse me, they weren't but a couple hundred yards from the main federal line. My understanding is he was shot as his horse was jumping across the barrier, and there were several eyewitnesses who saw him shot, but I think he was killed pretty instantly. He was hit more than once. Yeah. And it escapes me exactly if he was still on horseback or off the horse, but he was shot several times.
And for a long time, that monument to him was one of the only features of the battlefield you could see. But if you go to that area today, it's rehabilitated. You can actually see a little park. And one of the things that I like so much is that there's a line of gravel that actually cuts through the park that shows you where the line had been. And you can see just how close Cleburne was to that breakthrough.
Well, Chris, to take it a step further, you bring up an interesting point. But in 2005, when Cleburne was killed, there was a Pizza Hut restaurant. And in 2003, a writer by the name of Adam Goodhart wrote an article about the lousy state of the park of the battlefield in Franklin. And I've got the National Geographic article that it was in. I've got the actual magazine. And that article created a lot of embarrassment for the city fathers of Franklin and Pizza Hut. So it wasn't long. That was the start of the modern preservation movement here in Franklin, was that removing that Pizza Hut. So Pizza Hut offered to sell to the city. Ironically, they just moved further south on the battlefield, but still, they sold it, and the Pizza Hut was removed 2004, 2005, and that's where the stacked cannonballs came from, and that was the first plot of the modern preservation movement in Franklin.
So now a number of different entities have been involved with the rehabilitation of the battlefield, including, the Roundtable has pitched in, the Battle of Franklin Trust, the American Battlefield Trust, private donors of all sorts. The city has been really behind it. What's it been like to be at ground zero for one of the great preservation successes of our lifetime?
Well, that's another big story. And as a matter of fact, we have another publication that the state put out specifically about our success in Franklin. I will tell you the low point. The low point was about 2003, 2004, literally where Patrick Cleburne's vision stepped off. They had just broken the ground to build a target. And I was down there one day and I'm walking around scratching my head going, can't we save anything? The trees are knocked down, rabbits are running around, the little stream that's mentioned in the battle reports, it's being wrecked. That was about as low as I got. And then this other stuff started happening, and we don't have time to tell you all the details, but that's when it started going up. And yeah, it was some of the most heady moments I've had in history. Things happened. We got political support locally. We started negotiating with landowners. Chris, we bought $2 million properties and didn't have a nickel in the bank. And we've signed for it, and landowners will work with us, and we come up with funds through all kinds of sources. Long story short, now you come to Franklin, you've got 20 acres around the core area there, not to mention another 110 at one of the flank sites. So it's been very gratifying. It's been very exhausting. I had very little to do with it. I was just one of the foot soldiers. But you mentioned the groups involved. The lead group is a group called Franklin's Charge that came together right about the time of the Pizza Hut thing. And it's kind of like the United Nations of preservation groups. Everybody, basically, Franklin's Charge was an umbrella, and all the local groups had a seat at the table. Instead of us all fighting for resources and all that, we all came together with this one goal in mind. Franklin's Charge has coordinated the whole thing with a big assist for the Battle of Franklin Trust, the American Battlefield Trust, American Battlefield Preservation Group. I forget their name exactly, but they're part of the Park Service. And as we sit here right now, we're still negotiating on property. When opportunities come up and landowners approach us, we're still talking.
Being here in Central Virginia, one of the things we're actually proud of with the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust is an early fundraiser that CVBT did actually went toward battlefield preservation in Franklin, thanks to Robert Lee Hodge.
Oh, yeah. Robert Lee Hodge. Yep.
So I remember when you and I walked the ground around the Carter House, and you said, "This is it. This is the epicenter of the fighting." And we talked a little bit about that breakthrough. A lot of back and forth. Updike comes in to help plug that gap, but that really is kind of like, the center of the maelstrom, if you will. What was it like to be there at that moment in the battle? Because it's such a peaceful spot today.
Hard to imagine. I can't imagine. I've never experienced combat. As you know, right there at that main point on the highway there, Arthur MacArthur was severely wounded. Douglas MacArthur's father. Ironically, he wasn't aware at the time, but his future daughter-in-law's grandfather was fighting for the Confederates right there at the same spot. One of those ironies of history. It got down to hand to hand. The guys were hitting each other with rifle butts, pickaxes, whatever they could find. A lot. When we did some of the archaeological work, as we bought some of the properties, one of the requirements was, you do an archaeological survey, and we actually came up with like pieces of hands and fingers and those kind of things.
Wow.
Been there since the battle. Yeah.
Wow. And one of the houses there on the Carter House property, is such a testament to all the bullet holes in the wall, such a testament to the severity of the fighting there that you can, it looks just like someone went through the hole puncher and just boom, 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 boom.
That's supposedly the most damaged existing Civil War property in America today. Yeah. And like you said, there's almost more holes than there is wood.
So aside from the action there around the Carter House, folks can also go out and visit Carton. Tell us a little bit about what happened out in that part of the battlefield.
Well, if you're looking at the epicenter of the attack, that's dead center. It went a little ways to the left or to the west, but then it extended all the way right, all the way over back to the Harpeth River when the Harpeth River bends back south. And there's a historic plantation called the Carton Plantation there. Beautiful place. Confederate right charged through there. It was Loring's Brigade, Mississippians, and they came through the Carton Plantation. They started taking shell fire from Fort Granger, and it was people don't recognize it as much because it doesn't quite have the house there. You could see all the bullet holes, but the fighting was just as intense, and they made it to within the city limits of Franklin. They were not able to break the federal lines there. They ran into a lot of artillery, and in fact, the biggest number of fatalities in the Carton Cemetery are from Loring's troops because they took such heavy losses there. But today, if you go out there, at one time it was an 18-hole golf course, and that's part of the story too, and we preserved that, and now it's interpreted as the right flank of the battle.
And of course, the Porch of Carton is one of those iconic Civil War landscapes because dead Confederate officers were laid out on that porch afterwards, and it was such a stunning moment to see the cost of that battle laid out on that porch.
Yeah, there's always been a debate how many general officers were laid out there. I think the actual number is 4, but there were 6 Confederate general officers killed in that battle, and Carton was used as a hospital, and it stayed as a hospital for weeks after the battle. And if you go there today and go upstairs, it's very obvious where the blood's on the floor. You could see footprints in the blood and all that kind of thing. The house was just far enough south to avoid any actual fighting, but it did take some artillery, a little bit of artillery fire from the Federals, and there's been some shells dug up around the house, that kind of thing. But it's a great place to go today, and it's it's one of the big tourist draws here in Franklin.
Yeah. The cemetery that's there, the McGavick family that lived there, that ended up burying so many of the Confederate dead in their cemetery. And to me, that's such a poignant place to visit, to walk among essentially you're walking among the graves of the Army of Tennessee, buried there in the field.
Well, the cemetery is an interesting story as well. The McGavicks owned Carton, the McGavick family. And there was a lady by the name of Carrie McGavick. Well, in the spring of 1866, 1,500 Confederates had been buried in shallow graves around the Carter House. And a fellow by the name of George Cuppet, who was a member of Terry's Texas Rangers, the Texas Cavalry, had come through Franklin and had fallen in love with the overseer of the Carton Plantation, Malvina College. So he missed the Battle of Franklin. He winds up getting captured and surrenders in East Tennessee. He comes back to Nashville in the spring of 1866, comes back down, finds Malvina, they get married. Well, Carrie McGavick, who owned the property there at Carton, heard about the situation with these Confederate soldiers 2 miles away, buried in shallow graves. And so she donated the land for the Confederate cemetery. Then she hired George Cuppet, $5 a head, whatever it was. And during the spring of 1866, he and his brother Marcellus moved 1,500 bodies from Carter House to Carton. And it's a great story. He recorded those who had ID markers on them. If he could find anything, he would record them, write their names down, kept a ledger of all those who were killed there. And there's a significant number of unknowns. But that ledger is still at the Carton House today, and you can see it. And until she died, Carrie McGavick was getting inquiries from people wanting to know if maybe their loved one was on that ledger because they never knew what happened to him. His brother Marcellus, during this entire process, died, and a lot of people say he died of heartbreak and stress. He's the only civilian in that cemetery. Marcellus was a civilian, and he's buried with the Texans there at the cemetery.
I remember you taking me over to his gravesite and explaining that story, and what a powerful postscript to
Yeah.
that story. So the the morning after the battle, Schofield makes his escape. Everybody on both sides completely shell shocked. No one's quite sure what to make of this, but somebody's got to make something of it. What happens in those few hours right after the battle as both sides are trying to make sense of the carnage?
Well, like I said, Schofield, they make tracks up to Nashville. Nashville's one of the most fortified cities in the country by this time. So they get into the federal lines in Nashville, and almost immediately they're getting reinforced. There's troops coming in via boat and train. Um, Hood, I guess, yeah, this is a head scratcher here for me. Is I'm not real sure why he pursued them. His army was wrecked. I know they spent a lot of time just cleaning up the battlefield and trying to bury their dead and picking up weapons and that kind of thing. But they move on to Nashville, and they they put together a siege, if you want to call it that, and they sit there. Sit there a couple of weeks outside of Nashville, freezing, and then of course, by the time the Battle of Nashville started, they were out. Federals were outnumbered on 10-1, something like that, and they came out of their lines, and that was pretty much the end of the Army of Tennessee. Other than those that survived the retreat.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've always scratched my head about it too. And I keep coming back to the idea of how desperate things are for Hood, and what other choices does he really have? I mean,
His only choice would have been a logical choice would have been maybe to just head back south, try to regroup, try to heal your wounds, because the Federals had up to this point had still not made a big effort of moving much further south than Franklin, because of their supply lines, that kind of thing. But ultimately, they were a defeated army. Maybe they would have combined with Lee or something, or Joe Johnston, but there was nothing else going to happen in Middle Tennessee of any significance.
And of course, by that point, the election's over in the North, so any impact the campaign would have had on the election is long gone and expired. And so, it is a head scratcher for sure. Do you think that just because Nashville has all their supplies, is Hood maybe thinking, "Gosh, if I can just crack this line and get at some of those supplies, I can keep my army alive"? I don't know.
Yeah, and there are people who know a lot more about Hood and his relationship with Richmond and Jeff Davis and all that than I do. But I'm not sure he was getting much direction from Richmond. I don't know that anybody ever said, General, you need to retreat, save your army, and that goes all the way to the top. But he should have. I think at that point in time, it was a lost cause. Of course, all the supplies and everything in Nashville were very attractive and would have been a game changer. But how are you going to get them? I mean, it was you weren't going to crack Nashville at that point. I was just going to say too that one of the stories that's been lost in this whole thing is the retreat. And if I'm an expert at anything, I'm pretty much close to it on the retreat part of it. And that's a remarkable story that people don't talk about. But that army could have just surrendered at that point after Nashville, because they were being heavily pursued by 10,000 of Wilson's cavalry. But they didn't. It goes to the grit and courage of those guys, and not, you got to give Hood some credit for that. He did not surrender the army there, and that's another month of drama that most people don't really even know about.
So, last question for you, Greg, as we look back almost 160 years later now at the Battle of Franklin, what do you see as the main takeaway for us today from the Battle of Franklin?
Courage. How 18, 19, 20-year-old kids would give up everything they had for what they believed in. And you compare that to us today, and we're kind of selfish, coddled people today. These guys, I've done enough reenactments to know that, you go out on a Friday night, you sleep out, and then the next day you do your stuff, but you're not really getting shot, and you're going to go back to camp and have a good meal, and you're going to sleep in comfort relatively, and you know on Sunday you're going to go back home and take a hot shower. How these guys do what they did. The Confederate soldiers marching those kind of miles under those kind of conditions, under that kind of stress, without any kind of proper food, is amazing. And the federal soldiers during the retreat, Wilson's cavalry, they were in the saddle for hours and hours and hours. I don't know how they did it. I really don't.
Well, I think it's especially fitting then, as you talk about courage and endurance and youth. I'll point back to those flags hanging behind you there, because they symbolize that very same thing, don't they?
Well, that same blood runs through a lot of kids today.
Yeah.
It's a good thing it does.
Great, Wade. I've had a great time talking with you tonight. I appreciate your time today.
Well, it's been fun. I hope I didn't wander around and confuse everybody, but there's a whole lot that happened, and it's hard to lay it out sometimes.
So, and if folks have the opportunity, if you're in Franklin, it's a battlefield worth going to as a destination. Franklin, beautiful city. And if you're lucky, maybe you can sit in on a roundtable meeting with Greg and his colleagues at the Franklin Civil War Roundtable.
Well, just let us know when you're coming.
Very good. Thanks again, Greg. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.
Okay.